Welcome back to If I Knew You Better. My name is Brendan Davis, and I'm the host. And typically, if you listen to this show, you know this already. And if you're new, let me kind of lay it out really briefly. Typically on this show, I do a bit of a deep dive interview with someone to get to know them, working in arts or entertainment, or doing something kind of interesting out in the world, and really get to know sort of their life story, their journey, how they got from there to here to where they're going, et cetera, et cetera. And I've decided in this time of the COVID-19 to do this new segment. And so this is my third in a row with actually an old friend. And in this case, this friend's been on one of my podcasts or another several times. And we're going to do a bit of a deep dive on how this is impacting them and get into the here's and the theirs and the whatnots. Jonathan Garrison, welcome to the show, man.
Brendan, thanks for having me back on. It's great for us to get in touch. It feels like even though you're just so close in Los Angeles, I'm here in Salt Lake City, Utah. It still feels like we're a long ways apart with this kind of country lockdown.
I relate to that very much. I definitely relate to that.
You may as well be in Beijing.
Before I ramble on too much, let's get a little bit of information about you before I get too far down the track. What's kind of the brief background in case someone has not heard one of your other appearances on one of my shows or heard me talking about you in context of work stuff? What's kind of the short version of your story?
Sure. Thanks for asking. Well, we're newly back to the United States, and that's related to my current business. I've been in China for a number of years. Altogether, been about 20 years of kind of involvement with China, whether that was graduate school or early jobs. And then most recent 10 years, roughly, most of that time I've spent in Beijing. But had set up a company with a partner of mine after I had left some previous employment and working in like cross-border investments and what we call the cultural industries. So a lot of that focus on film and entertainment, themed attractions, and travel, tourism, sport. So in October, luckily, we were just kind of ahead of the outbreak in China. We moved from Beijing back to Salt Lake City. I have a partner here in Salt Lake. He's Chinese. We used to work at Goldman Sachs together, so we go back quite a ways. And we have a small business that we started really in the in-flight entertainment space. So we were kind of an agent for international ad sales. Mm-hmm. We really focused on the travel and tourism marketplace. And so obviously, as China's outbound tourism was growing and the sort of value of spend amongst those outbound tourists from China was also growing even faster, that was a very coveted segment for destinations and brands internationally to access. So we've set up some partnerships in China that get us in front of those audiences, as well as like in movie theaters, on high-speed rail. So looking for sort of unique audiences in China that were sort of pre-assembled and then pitching those to our clients. Obviously, that's had a really big impact. When we talk impacts of coronavirus, that'll be pretty apparent. One of the things we did, I think, smartly, though, I mean, you can never really foresee or time something like what we're experiencing right now with the pandemic, but we had looked at, let's try to insulate our business by getting a little more diversified. And for us, that meant let's just look at what are either related businesses that sort of are outgrowths of what we're doing in this space for like travel promotion. When I say that travel promotion, like we work with Brand USA, for example. And so they're kind of the public-private partnership that promotes tourism to the U.S. Various destinations. So we've worked with them with like 40 different states and different brands and destinations here in the U.S. and particularly focused on that exposure to the Chinese audience. And so then looking at like what are other outgrowths of Chinese travel and Chinese study, other things like that in the U.S. So we have some partnerships in financial technology, dealing with payments. And And then we look at some trade opportunities. And really, we're going back the other direction with trade, which is sourcing high quality U.S. manufactured goods in kind of sensitive areas, not sensitive in terms of strategic type of things,
right.
but like performance supplements, things like that, that are, it's important that people don't get poisoned when they're taking their,
sure.
Amino acids or something like that. And working with, again, with kind of audiences that are already pre-assembled. Either they're like, there's a company who has a base of membership, but they're just not doing this type of business with that audience, but it's a very appropriate extension of their brand. That gives us an opportunity to step in and we've really put together the whole value chain of partnerships, from sourcing product here in the U.S. to packaging to freight forwarding and customs brokerage in China, cross-border e-commerce platform. So there's a variety of things, which I think is healthy for any small business. There's always that temptation that just focus on the one thing you're doing and do it really well, which is great until you have sort of exogenous pressures like a coronavirus situation.
Sure.
It could really impact that whole market for months to come.
Right.
And that's a vulnerability that you've got to foresee. And these things are all trade-offs. I think that'll probably be the theme of our discussion today. These are economic questions. It's competition for limited resources by infinite demands. And some of those demands as an entrepreneur are your time and your preparation. And can you afford to have your eyes all over the place? And the sort of reverse of that, or flip side of that question, is can you afford not to have some measure of diversification in your operations that would insulate you from major shocks?
Right. And so let me throw a few things out in terms of other context for our chat. So the person listening can understand some of our references that we'll use with each other. Of course, we're friends from the China side of this, and we have also, again, we've done several podcasts, and so I'll link those in the show notes if people want to go and do your deep dive, interesting story, or hear us talking about rock and roll or punk rock specifically. But of course, we overlap professionally on the film side of the business, and are involved, full disclosure, we're involved in a project. John is one of the EPs on this movie project that I've referenced that we're working on. And of course, dealing with the contingencies as we have to, speaking of having your eggs sort of in one basket in my case, although I guess I have about another half a basket here and there. But in terms of that situation, I reference this not only in terms of a disclosure, but also to say that, both of us are people who've worked in you at a very high executive level, and me at like the on the ground, producer level and filmmaker level within the China system, and as to different degrees as China Hollywood bridges or consultants. And I've already been I was rolling that carpet up a year ago because, more than that, because of how the industry there is so fundamentally different than the quote unquote Hollywood industry, which I know, although that's really a fairly global system. You likewise, again, having a lot of other interests, you didn't have all your eggs in that basket, but for your own reasons, you mentioned that you moved, you got ahead of this curve by a long shot. You moved for other reasons. Can I ask you a little bit about, you've seen China over this long period of time, as you said, from grad school to professional engagements and whatnot. What are some of the changes that you've seen in the last few years, however you want to word it? I'm not trying to put you in the hot seat, but what are some of the sort of macro changes you observed in recent history? I'd like to talk about some things besides COVID-19, and that's one that you're very well situated to sort of opine on, I think. And why did you basically move back home, if I may?
I think that to make it sound a little less than a whim than it may have actually been, but we had come back. I have a young daughter and wife, and she's from China. Our daughter was born in China. but we had come back to the United States for the summer and hadn't spent an extended period of time here together. And we just had such a great experience. And being in the Salt Lake area, which we're familiar with, I grew up in Boston, but moved out here and went to the University of Utah, right up the hill here in Salt Lake. Mm-hmm. I'm right kind of downtown. So as I look out the window now, I'm on my porch. There's no one around, so I'm still social distancing, but there's the beautiful Wasatch Mountains all covered in snow right in the distance. But we got to enjoy some of that, just being out in nature and seeing wildlife. And that's an experience that's hard to get consistently in China. Mm-hmm. It's available, but it's not easy, especially if you're a city dweller. It's really getting out of the city. Kind of reminded me of, time I've spent and lived in New York, where, getting out of town is a couple of hour endeavor, and there'll be long lines of traffic trying to get back into the city on a Sunday night. So similar kind of experience. I think business-wise, other than just that personal desire to get back and spend some time here, we feel that we're flexible enough that should business require it, we would go back to China, and that wouldn't be a problem for us. Mm-hmm. We have no objection to returning if that circumstance lines up. When it came to business, for us, it was just the company that I founded, En route Global, with my partner, and our En route Media entity here in Salt Lake. It was kind of mature enough, and we were also being asked, because of some of the success we had in bringing in a major partner for advertising initiatives. Mm-hmm. On that in-flight space, we had been tapped by the companies involved in providing that system and that service on the airplane to help work out some content partnerships. Mm-hmm. And this is, as they're getting into new Wi-Fi delivery mechanism, it's going to be an interesting thing in China. That'll happen it'll grow quickly. There's already a number of planes that are outfit with Wi-Fi capability, and so that makes the entertainment options just that much more easily accessible. And they're looking to really make that whole environment operate like the internet operates. Like for us, when you're at home, you choose gaming, episodic content, feature films, mm-hmm. music, a whole variety like that, and also through your own device. So we've been asked to work on some of those content partnerships, and so coming back here was part of that plan as well.
Right.
So we should go live in May, and that's just sort of professionally it made sense to come back. I think things that we were noticing and that I've been keeping my eye on, because I had had a time, and we've talked about it in a former podcast, I believe, but I worked at in the security side of the business in China. So in a broker dealer, that was with Goldman Sachs, their local office. And then in about 2012, during the AMC transaction, it was a very big movie theater acquisition by the Wanda Group.
Sure, it's huge.
That company was looking to put some kind of international expertise under their roof. They didn't really have any kind of international investment team, international partnerships, anyone with that kind of experience. And so I joined a small group that was the international investment group, and we had guys focused on some professionals focused on real estate, commercial real estate projects, mm-hmm. others that were looking more at domestic acquisitions that made sense, but it was really getting not just international, but all of the company's kind of investment activity into one place. And then rather than having, disparate groups and sub-companies and that type of experience, people out there in the world sort of saying they so-called represent the company and their investment mm-hmm. Direction. I think it was a very good idea. It was surprising when I got in and sort of understood how the company functioned, that they had that kind of foresight. It didn't really function in that capacity, to be honest, but,
okay. Yeah.
But there was a time there where I think that was the vision. And I think that's a good idea for a company to not have multiple different voices out in the market about where their investment objectives lay.
Sure. That makes a
But it
lot
was a
of
great
sense.
experience.
Yeah.
I was with Wanda for a number of years, but I think you and I had been in Beijing for much of, I think for a lot of the time we overlapped. I moved back in 2010, but the last few years we've known each other fairly well.
Yeah. I was full time the last 4 years, and I got to know you about a year and a half into that, I guess. So, so since that amount of time, we've been kind of thick as thieves.
I think the high level kind of trends were like about that time that I was getting involved in those sorts of international investments. There was a bit of time where there was an encouragement for Chinese companies to kind of go abroad, to internationalize a bit more. These are always, part of policy. Obviously, in China, these things are never detached from what the party's objectives are.
Sure.
And that may be, there's probably a variety of things, from more internationalization of the Chinese yuan to just better integration into the global markets and economies, and also some level of acquisition of technology and expertise. And those are, I think, reasonable goals. But we saw that sort of wave for a couple of years in that sort of 2011 or probably 2014, 15. And then what seemed to be a little bit of reversal of fortune of those companies that were leading out. It kind of reminds me of that, the sort of reform and opening, the very first salvo of that was, Chairman Deng Xiaoping was, at that time was like allowing, basically was signaling to the market that, and to China in general, that marketization and sort of liberalization will be tolerated and encouraged, but not really clear guidelines. And similar to what we saw just several years ago in China, like there's not really a clear demarcation, like don't cross this line.
Sure.
So sort of let that develop until someone does cross that line. And when they do, they learn kind of the hard way, and there's usually sort of a sharp kind of pullback on that direction. And it really impacts the political fortunes of those individuals and companies. And you start to see them become targets for investigations and things like that. And so that was kind of a bit of a trend where those companies in China that had been going more abroad were really not going to be in a position to do that. And kind of the restatement of the policy would be more state enterprise driven, and that it would line up with things like the Belt and Road Initiative and not be done on a haphazard fashion of, well-off companies in China acquiring Club Med or yacht companies and things like that.
Sure.
Like we had things.
It was going to fall within the strictures and within the mandates of what they wanted for society. It was going to fall within that pretty strictly.
Yeah, and it's always that's always an interesting thing to keep in mind when you're working with China, when you're visiting China, is that despite the sort of ease of thinking of it as this monolith of the party and the leadership get to sort of do whatever they want, there's a certain degree with which that's true, but they are subject to a lot of pressures. And so it's easy to it's convenient, I think, to think, well, one party, and we have these conversations amongst friends and acquaintances many times where they look at the United States being a lot less capable and flexible and just it's harder to get things done here as a result of, say, multi-parties. There's too many voices. But it's really, if you look at China closely, they may not be parties, but there are big constituencies that the government is subject to. There's the rural population. There's the military is a major one. Obviously, the press doesn't function there the way that it does here, and so there's less of that. But there are many constituencies throughout China that put pressure on leaders locally and even ultimately kind of nationally.
Right.
So there are voices that they have to be thoughtful about. I think some of that reversal of fortune for those companies that were first going abroad was listening to some of those voices, like, what good is this doing for people in China, for billionaires in these enterprises that have been really bolstered by, balance sheets backed by state-owned banks,
state debt, yeah.
They kind of look at it like, this isn't necessarily your money, this is our money, and you're using it to leverage a transaction to go buy vineyards in France. Like,
right.
How does that help anybody here?
You're right.
And that's typical of China having kind of a very mercantilist kind of view of things. That one of the sort of underlying reasons why the currency has the controls on it that it does, that outflows of wealth are seen as problematic, and surpluses in trade and surpluses of incoming wealth are signs of growth and progress. I think that's kind of an antiquated economic model to build on, but it's still, I think, pretty prevalent in thinking, economic thinking in China. I was going to say, I think the third sort of stage of that. So these are some recent trends in the last, 8-10 year, last decade, I would say. The time goes so quickly. But one of those is people responding to a slowing economy. And this is a really interesting phenomenon to watch. I think this will be probably the most significant thing to observe as China is coming out of, what would go back to COVID, but this pandemic situation and their recent lockdown, nearly countrywide, is how they respond to an economic shock like this. Had been nearly 20 years of just nonstop growth and growth at very high rates, and lots of fortunes made, and a lot of people, moving into, more of a middle class lifestyle.
Sure.
Throughout China, the growth of a consumer class that had not been there.
A lot of Mercedes and Porsches in the parking deck underneath my apartments.
Yeah, always fascinating, right? In Beijing to see. I'd never seen more luxury cars.
In
a place, and even living in Los Angeles, I didn't see that.
For reference, if the same place, price point, if that was here, it would be new Hondas and Toyotas, but it would be those. It would not be, it would not be $100,000 plus $200,000 cars. So please continue. I don't want to interrupt. You're giving me more than I could have dreamed for when I asked this question. This is, I really want to.
But isn't that interesting though? It's interesting to watch. Like, so we don't know exactly, I think, the answer to that, but you could start to hear it, and I was hearing it amongst potential investors and clients. And we had a bit of, because we have an entity in Shenzhen, and we were running through that some kind of advisory business where we had interesting clients in those cultural industry spaces, companies doing like theme park design and film technology and things like that, and some sports and sports technology kind of combinations. But things I think that all were great fit for whom we were pitching them and working on in China. But you get this real sense of like what they're seeing, lower growth numbers, and maybe even periodic, continual sort of incremental revisions downward in growth numbers. Yeah. And just people get nervous. And I think with that, the backdrop of that is looking at how has wealth been distributed, what's really happening to wages and purchasing power. And those are some things, not that they drove us out of China. I think our reasons for coming back were pretty simple, but those are things that worried me when I lived there, that like rents going up in the manner that they had, especially in the larger cities, the cost of food, like as a part of the CPI was just incredible. The rates of increase in just some basic staples. So to live and get by and sort of build a life in a city, really difficult. And I'm not sure, in coming back to the U.S., it's a different world now than it was 20 some odd years ago when I spent, a summer working as a college student and went back during the summer break and worked in New York. And I could have, I think, conceivably found a roommate or two from among some of my coworkers and just said, hey, I want to stay in New York. It's a great place to be as a young person.
Sure.
And kind of scrape out a living. And I think that's even gotten much more difficult.
I think,
with some of those same kind of pressures.
Yeah. Those kids are traveling in to and from their gigs. They're living far.
Yeah.
Away, but
yeah. And California, you see that happen.
Oh God.
All over the place.
It's crazy how expensive this place. I mean, it was getting there when I left, and it's at a whole other level now.
And I was hearing that in China. And one of the things I think that there is a real distinction in these two economies is we've been through shocks and recessions and periods of, negative growth and things that they've just not really experienced on a large scale in China for this entire generation.
Yeah.
There's almost no professional background.
Yeah. There's no collective memory of what this is or how to deal with it and what it even, what it means. Because there's the existential sort of questions, even if they're not spoken in that sort of hippie language that I have, but they're the questions of how does this affect us? How does this affect me? They're the reactions at first when you don't even really know what a thing is. And so they haven't even really confronted a lot of that yet, like ever. So it's a really crazy, it's a really crazy set of circumstances with which to head into the abyss, basically.
And I don't
know if I'm being too dramatic, but I think
I agree.
Be
and I think
uncalled for.
I think we'd be good to feel a little bit more comfortable here in the U.S. that there has been some experience with things like this before, and nothing to this scale. Tomorrow's my birthday. I'll be 48. In 48 years,
there's
never been anything close to this.
Oh man! Well, happy early birthday! And when this airs, we're recording. So your birthday's Tuesday. We're releasing this Friday. So people wish you a happy belated.
Thank you, much appreciated.
Yes.
But yeah, that we have a little bit of kind of institutional memory about this, but at the same time, one of the interesting observations you have about these is that they don't happen so frequently that we have. It's new for everybody.
We don't have a whole playbook or anything. We just have some analogs.
Yeah, and I think there's some comfort that we will recover from this, and that there's not really something fundamentally flawed in the economy. We might find, though, if there are those flaws, something like a pandemic would certainly be the thing to exacerbate them and trigger them and sort of, set fire to that fuse.
Right.
But it didn't seem like that was the real issue. So we're in interesting times. We're obviously at the sort of somewhere near that peak of the curve on one side or the other. We get new data every day. It does seem like we're on kind of the front end of it and won't be coming through a back end too quickly. But then
here in the US, yeah. And of course we're seeing our friends and family back in China, talking to them on WeChat or whatever, and we're aware of how accuracy or confidence you can have in the reporting notwithstanding, which is a real issue. But setting that aside for a minute, just the facts on the ground are that it's they are clearly past the worst of it. And people are starting to sort of figure out the new normal on their end, which is part of where we're of course going to go here. But yes, please continue.
That's what interests me the most is obviously like two things are in mind for me each day, which is sort of the most immediate things. There are some concerns about just keeping yourself kind of supplied and doing that responsibly.
Sure.
And if there's any other kind of like family obligations, things like that, it will be interesting really, really quickly because we've already had people that have a large portion of the population who haven't been, earning wages and they've been furloughed or they've been laid off. and we've got a first of a month coming up, and those are always interesting challenges. What's going to happen with rents and evictions, and it's both on a residential and a commercial side of things. That can just be really telling on how impactful that is.
Yeah.
And
absolutely.
to go another month with that same situation, you just feel for anyone who is like, I don't have the luxury to just accept this furlough and do nothing. I'm going to have to go out and work in delivering goods, or I'm going to be on a front line somewhere where now I've just sort of necessity put myself at much greater risk.
It's a very soul-searching moment, I think, for a lot of people. That's a theme that I kind of keep coming back to in my own inner monologue, and I've also talked about it with people, just as friends or for shows or whatnot lately. But I don't want to skip to the end where I ask you about the upside. We'll save that. I want to talk about how you're adjusting in terms of work, other adaptations. We'll talk about a few things before we get there. But I guess I wanted to inject this here, which is that something about this that's unique is, well, its uniqueness, the fact that we have not had in the internet age, correct me if you think I'm wrong, but I can't think of anything else that has been so global of an event that, although there are these ripples and waves, places weeks behind the places that got it earlier, etc., but we have not had this global event where we're all dealing in some way with the same thing that underlines the core humanity. So our individual experiences, of course, are different based on who we are, what we do, where we are, etc. But we're all going to be living in much different realities. We're going to be in a new normal. I've been using it a lot, and now it's starting to get overused, I see. So we're going to be in a new reality, whatever the hell it's going to be. So I think the way to best prepare for that is to look at what you're doing now and figure out what adaptations you can make or must make. How do you future-proof yourself? This is something that anyone who's entrepreneurial or self-employed, like we mostly both are, you're trying to look around the corner, right? Trying to figure out, what are those, what's an opportunity, what's an approach that I see, and I feel like I could really, this would be a good way to go, but it's not, but everybody's not doing it. So there's a real opportunity. How are you looking ahead? I mean, you have to have that sort of mindset to deal with this unknowable reality, right? When everybody's kind of a survivor of the COVID wars globally, and we're all walking around with that shared little piece of humanity that's underlined. I mean, how do you think that's going to affect things? How are you possibly adapting your thinking, et cetera?
No, all really good issues to discuss. I think one thing I think of, and this is a little bit relevant to, I think it relates to discussions we're seeing about the response here in the U.S. and in other places globally, like sort of it's an opportunity to score some points politically, and some of that may be justified. But to be honest, like, we know that there are low probability events out there. I mean, if it wasn't a coronavirus, it's going to be like a meteor the size of, Atlas Mountain or something coming our way. There's possibilities of those kind of things we know are out there. We don't live our daily lives with like ticking a box on a daily contingency for that particular thing.
Yeah.
It's impossible. You can't really function like that with all of the risks in mind, especially, I mean, you would certainly be smart to focus on the higher probability issues, but it's always that they're weighted by their impact. You have a low probability, very high impact. That's going to take some precedence over high probability, low impact. But this is a once in 100-year type of thing. It seems really unreasonable that almost any entrepreneur would have, and many businesses and even countries would have extensive preparations for this. I think the ability to respond has been the most interesting and impressive thing about it. So we don't have all the testing, and look, each one of these kind of an outbreak would have its own special fingerprints to it. Mm-hmm. But the ability to sort of rally, share information, develop more effective and more effective testing, treatment, ultimately vaccines, is something that I think that there's been great coordination on. And it's unfortunate there's finger pointing between nations, and that's going to happen. There's people that are out there that are idiots in peacetime, let alone pandemic time, and they're going to find an opportunity to sort of voice that. I think in general, I agree with you. I think we all kind of are going to feel that this is sort of what every American felt on, November 1963. They know where they were when they heard that news of the Kennedy assassination. Everyone's going to sort of know what their experience was as they went through this whole thing. I do think there's some interesting opportunities, not to jump to kind of bright sides.
Go ahead.
Less bright side. This is more, there's opportunity for entrepreneurs to fill that gap. I long had thought that, when it comes to emergency preparedness issues, I can geek out a little because I was an Eagle Scout in the Boy Scouts, and so one of the merit badges
yes, you were
emergency preparedness.
Yeah,
so
I had that one too, although I was not an Eagle Scout.
That's a great thing to teach young people, and it's a great way to have honest conversations to them about risks that will pose themselves in the world, some natural and some economic, and what do you do to be prepared for that. And I think it opens up new models for how do we do that? Because obviously, people keeping the appropriate stores of food and other dry goods and other things like that can be challenging. I mean, you can do it with a bit of research. You go find, what do I need and how should I rotate it and how does it fit into my normal diet so that I'm not just stockpiling food that goes bad and I get rid of it all every year. That's kind of silly. So there's a little bit of a finesse to it, a little bit of science and art to managing that. And that seems like a perfectly ripe situation given technology. Also, even given what we're seeing in just changes in people's patterns of consumption, we have shopping malls all over the country that have empty locations in them, but they're perfectly situated vis-a-vis the population to be a store for goods like this, and turn that into somewhat of a commercial service. Think of it like a subscription service for your emergency needs.
Sort of like Uber for preppers. Or
exactly. Yeah. And you have full transparency into it, and they can rotate things out to you. I just think there are opportunities that are going to open up like that. I hesitate to say that we're going to have a bunch of movie theaters that we don't need, but I'm certain that the theater companies, the theater operators, when they come back online, will have to evaluate what does their inventory look like, and we may have the utilization is just too low in some of those locations, and that experience will change for us.
Yeah,
I think though, just looking at people's behavior, what I kind of predict for responses to this, it's pretty hard to change people's behavior, even with a big shock of a pandemic like this. It's pretty hard to get people to just really change what they do. We're doing a lot of things now, like going to the movies, that people have done for centuries through plagues and through other, and other pandemics, and didn't come out the other end of it completely deterred.
How do you think some other things will shift in terms of, like you mentioned, certain habits are ingrained, certain things people just kind of can't wait to get back to, but what are some things you think will change, maybe for the positive or the negative in terms of macro, how people look at things, how people consider certain pursuits, whether it's personal or professional?
I think it's hard to generalize too much of it, because I would say what my instinct would be, there's going to be a little bit more, there's going to be a focus on saving for people. And so consumption and unnecessary consumption, that really impacts us because we do a lot of work in this sort of this travel space. And a lot of that travel is just going to be vacations. It's people that want to take their annual leave, they're in China and go to New York and Boston, or they want to go to the West Coast, or they will go to Niagara Falls or to the Grand Canyon. Those are going to be, I think, less of a priority. And I think in China, we're going to see this really dramatically, where that's the biggest concern I had right out of the gate. And we're having this conversation in the US for the last several weeks. But when you're just say, look, everyone, you have to stay home, that means a lot of people aren't going to get paid. And there's a lot of companies, even though the law may say to them, look, you need to pay your staff, there are much weaker worker protections, and the deck is really stacked against labor in China. And so a lot of people who just kind of went without, and they've gone, like we talked earlier, 20 some odd years with kind of just continuous positive growth figures, and
never a negative.
And that's really a new thing for China. You look at historically, China's always been this cycle, and it was because it was a much more agricultural nation and wasn't very high technology in terms of their agricultural market. And still have a long way to go in terms of deploying technology in agriculture, but because of that, I mean, obviously floods and hailstorms and famine and locusts and things like that come about periodically meant that they had a much more cyclical existence, and people really were ingrained. The previous generation, having gone through the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution and onto the eve of reform and opening, even like very frugal, save everything, don't spend money on themselves. They've gotten to be much more lavish with spending on their grandchildren these days. But the younger generation, it's not uncommon at all to find people that just, they spend everything they make every month.
Sure. Yeah. Do you think there's going to be a recoil against that, like a return to the older ways, like a new austerity of some kind, even if not at the highest mandated level?
I think there will, and I wouldn't be surprised if there's not also sort of like public, kind of party-driven campaigns.
Down.
Yeah, that are a little more like we've had these. You saw for years in Beijing all the posters about harmony and about friendship and these kind of like developing a healthy, kind of middle class type society.
Yeah.
Message. But if there wouldn't be something a little bit more on, prepare yourself to take care of your family, take care of your health, things like that. So that will be, I think, will have some impact on consumption across global markets. I think people will be like, look, some of the things we didn't need, we will pull back on. Entertainment will be impacted in that. Travel will be impacted. Just to simple things like, I'm going to simplify some of my subscription services. I'm going to economize on some of these, branded goods that I care less about now that we've gone through a very scary situation.
Right.
So there's that. But then there's always a fairly large market that are just going to go right back to business as usual and not take much away from it. I think that's why we have like parables and fairy tales that follow those patterns, because they've happened and that's how people tend to behave. I haven't done a lot of reading on that, though. I think one of the great upsides from this is an opportunity to read. I'm sorry if there's a little bit of noise, but a very noisy truck had just
no. It adds color. I've got a thin sliding door here, and so I get all kinds of motorcycle noise and such. So it just adds to the reality. So no, I enjoyed hearing the truck back up. We'll keep that in.
Other than that, our neighborhood is really, while we're on the neighborhood, our neighborhood's really quiet. I'm actually looking at this little cul-de-sac just right up the hill from us. And it's funny enough, I tease my wife about it a bit, that there's this little tiny neighborhood, and in that neighborhood, they didn't allow Blacks or Chinese to own the homes or to live in that neighborhood until like the 1930s.
Wow. Okay. Yeah.
It's kind of weird.
Well, it's American history.
But that was like the one neighborhood around this area. Funny, we were on that kind of conversation, how this will change people. I think some of the just economic kind of impacts, it will change some people's behavior, but that opens up new opportunities.
Sure.
People will still look to kind of invest. And I think smart investments in things that are kind of relevant to what we've gone through will make sense. How much of a blessing it is, though, like, and just how like fortunate we all are that it's happened at a time when we're so interconnected. And in a way, it's almost like, well, that's allowed it to exacerbate because of our level of connectedness.
Yeah, there's upside and downside to that reality.
Yeah, but at the same time, like, it is true that a lot of people can, when I worked at Goldman for years, once a month, once a quarter, actually, I would take a day or two off, not really off, but I would just work from home, using our sort of connectivity and Citrix connections and things like that to work remotely, just to prove that, look, we can still function as a team. We've got contingencies up. We can still settle trades. We can still do all of our required reporting and due diligence. Everything like that can still work. And that's true for a lot of people. And it kind of will get you thinking about what might this mean for the future of work. I do think what we're likely to see is almost the opposite effect. Some people would say, look, if so many people can work from home effectively, then they're going to find less and less need for these really expensive and opulent office spaces. And I think certainly there could be some optimization in that, like how much companies need to spend on like really expensive rents and things. I think a lot of people are going to go, it's so much better when we get to go into an office.
People like those offices are nice, the nice offices are nice if you're fortunate to work in that kind of world. And for everybody else passing by, it's something kind of nice to enjoy,
And I've worked in this like environment for a few years now, where I'm working primarily from home, or I've gone over to like a WeWork setup, and I like that. I just love to have the place to go because you've got other interaction. There's a little bit of who might you meet today, and you've got your own little place to get people together. So
I like those. Something that really took off in China. People listening who don't have any sort of China connection or aren't aware that actually some of the I mean, and there's some beautiful ones all over the place, but there were some really cool ones and technologically really, really like bleeding edge ones, especially like Beijing, Shanghai. There were some really nice places there. I mean, there are, but they're just closed, or they have been mostly closed right now. But yeah, it's a real part of the culture for entrepreneurial types. So you think there may be a little more of that, or a little more teleworking from telecommuting from home. But that the big offices aren't going away because you need the big shiny tower in the sky for other reasons.
I think that'll survive, and I do think that if companies find that, hey, we can have some portions of the office like work, they don't necessarily have to be in this location. It'll just be sort of another round that seems weird, like we didn't quite get to that step. So I'll give you an example. Like when I was back from China from grad school, Goldman had opened an office here in Salt Lake City, and I had worked with them in New York previously. And so with the very small new office here, I got in like when there was like 100 some odd employees. But the interesting thing was they'd set up that office to do something kind of new for the firm, but which didn't really materialize. They had the sort of .com bubble right around that time playing out. And so they just didn't develop. They basically cut back on the investment in that new business line. but they had this commitment to a facility. They built relationships with the governor's office of economic development, with the universities for, pipeline of new talent. And they put in some of that groundwork rather than just toss that out. They looked at, well, what could they bring from higher cost centers like Manhattan to Salt Lake? And they found a number of functions and kind of began just gradually building. Now they do all kinds of things, everything from trading and research and banking. And really, it doesn't make sense to have people in really high cost centers doing a lot of that work when you have a population capable of doing it in a much lower cost center. And so the next sort of iteration of that would seem to make sense, like that there will be even like smaller kind of teams that can be, we don't necessarily need you in this tower right downtown.
Kind of redistribute some of the different lines and in a way that's more economically feasible, but still works logistically.
There's a very well-known film technology company that I know of them in their offices in China and Shanghai, and that there was a team in Beijing, and they were in one of these co-working spaces, and they're really effective, and you could watch them sort of all work together, interact every day. And that team had a specific purpose, and it just made perfect sense. It really seemed like a smart thing to have that kind of branch out or break out into these kind of places and still maintain more of a headquarter. And I think more companies are doing that. And for my kind of size company, we're small enough. It makes perfect sense for us to go to one of the co-working spaces. And our preference always would be to let's look at some of those historic buildings downtown Salt Lake, which is kind of, Salt Lake City is pretty charming, I think. I should mention that right as we were going on lockdown, so it was on St. Patrick's Day.
Oh, right.
On the 17th, we woke up at about 7:10 in the morning to an earthquake. I think what woke me originally was the sound. And I know I've been around them. I've never really kind of felt or experienced one. And it felt like and sounded like this massive rumble and this up and down jolt. And then the whole place carried on for almost 15, 20 seconds. It seems like a really long time. Yeah. And the whole latter 10 seconds was kind of felt like being on a ship in the ocean. The ground felt like it was sort of, and you have those visions of the liquefied earth that they talk about that you get with certain kind of earthquakes, but it had that real kind of up and down rumble, and then there's just sort of side to side gentle swaying, and you could hear it. And then there was an aftershock in the 4 point something, just 40 minutes later. And
you feel that too.
It's awesome enough that it was kind of exciting to go through it. It wasn't so dramatic and devastating that things were falling down and we were panicked.
It was kind of, but
you can appreciate sort of the power of it.
It was on that continuum between excitement and terror. It wasn't fully to terror, but it was definitely thoroughly exciting. It sounds like. I remember we were on a business call after that happened, and I heard your hot take on that.
You'd think this would be a conversation point with everybody wherever you went. So tell me about your earthquake experience. We've all already moved right back into your social distancing experiences of the day, your kind of your shelter at home experience of the day. So
what's your lockdown look like? Yeah. Well, I was going to ask you. I sort of had two more main questions. I'm curious, and I'm not trying to draw you into anything. So in terms of political impact, though, I'm talking big picture, global. And if you want to talk local or U.S., that's fine too. But what, if any, political impact do you think this situation will have in the near to medium term? And then we'll do the upside, and I'll let you go on with your day.
That's one of the really interesting things to kind of ponder. I think and I consume a lot of news, enough that I don't get I don't get like bogged down and worried about it. I'm staying very positive here.
Mm-hmm.
And at the end of it, look, we're going through this. We're going to get through it. It will pass at some point. We're thankful we're in good health. Our family's in good health. We're trying to do our part, keep our distance. I think from political impacts, one of the things we look at, like the discussions of the response and was this country's response appropriate? Was that country's response appropriate? I think we'll get to more of an agreement. Like, let's avoid that problem in the future, and let's agree, like, what happens when we discover these kind of things. And I think there have been some of those in place. I think there's an attempt at sort of standardizing. This is who you report to, and this is how we come to assist each other in these times of need. But they just didn't seem to function all that well with China. I just think that's just another one of those things that's so fascinating about this. So it's something that the whole world's going through, and the kind of focal point of it is China, and then to a large extent now that the U.S. has like the most confirmed cases of infections, the U.S. So the U.S. and China will be real hot points. Obviously, Italy will always be a big piece of the conversation, and Spain more and more so. No. Iran as well.
Exactly.
But having, I think, a little bit more of, sort of that kind of coordination on these types of issues, I think that'll be a big output. I mean, a big impact. I think from the U.S. side, I don't know. It's hard to say. Like, I think we haven't yet seen really what the major impacts are going to be. And if this goes on for too much longer, and I think, I think that, like, look, the rush to pass a kind of a pandemic stimulus, like a relief kind of bill, is going to shed light on a lot of things as well. Like, where do we feel like we really needed to be of help? We're most of help, and then are there services or are there programs that would address some of those needs, and that they're there for an emergency process or emergency, situation in which they're required. Obviously, they're all kind of weighed against. Now, how do we do things like that without it sort of inspiring moral hazard or other sort of risk taking that that they're not intended to alleviate? But certainly, I'm interested in those kind of conversations. But I find it just fascinating when we look at one of the big questions of, well, where really does the buck stop? Because I agree, and I'm very much from a kind of student of economics originally, and been in business, and a bit more on the libertarian kind of side of how government and business relate to each other. But it does strike, I think, any fair-minded person is really unfair that the people who are going to take the brunt of this are all those who have the fewest protections, and they get laid off, they lose their jobs, or they have supply chains that break down, they don't have payments that are made, and things that are in a sense not promised them in that they're contractually obligated, but in some cases there are contracts in place that people aren't paying, and and then there's wages that you expect. You've kind of agreed with your employer, and you've planned your life in a certain way to accommodate their need for labor, and then that all goes away. And meanwhile, you have obligations you've made for paying rent and insurance and other utilities and things like that. And those don't stop. So it's okay for everybody to, like, screw you, but you have nowhere to pass it down the line. There has to be sort of a better think through of that whole cascading impact. And realize that, look, I understand that, look, if people are like, I lost my job, now I can't pay for A, B, or C, which I need to sustain me, so when things do open up, I can go back to work again. That what impact can some of those other things absorb that don't trigger, like we would see in a financial crisis, like trigger margin calls or trigger other sort of algorithmic program trading like impacts, that would lead to the failure of like collateralized securities and things, because so much of debt, consumer debt, auto debt, and certainly mortgages being kind of the biggest part of that.
Yeah, it's just
are
bundled and
continually bundled up and sold, and they have to be. That's just not, the banking system is not built to say sit on a pile of mortgages. They're meant to fund due diligence and underwrite mortgages, and then they'll sell them to in packages where they're more appropriately held. But it does create some problems where if we don't have that kind of transparency, or we don't have sort of a trigger in there that can respond in kind to what's happened, in an impact of this sort, which is really kind of a force majeure scenario for anybody. That's something I think we definitely welcome a conversation about. I think both sides of the kind of political spectrum and all in between can agree that those are appropriate, that they're not throwing out sort of those things that make us, naturally make us Americans, and really kind of tie back to constitutional principles. It's always tempting for people to think the government can just do whatever they want. It's a real interesting test piece. I think there's a high level of voluntary compliance. You're going to get a lot of people who involuntarily don't comply, and they can put people at risk, and that can be a problem. But if we're not invoking like martial law and like suspending the Constitution, if you're suspending the Constitution, really on what authority is anybody acting at that point? So there is a limit to that, and I think it's one that we understand and accept generally in the U.S. I'd like to think that. That may be a little bit wishful thinking.
Well,
that
people who think on it, have an understanding of it. I don't know that everybody would have the same understanding for sure, but please continue. And
it's not to say like this is a scathing critique, because I find those always kind of grating of China and their handling of doing things. They have their way of doing things, and they have throughout history they've had sort of similar forms of authoritarian governments, and haven't had really a successful experiment in more democratic or democratic Republican kind of values and systems. We wouldn't choose their system given a clear choice between that, and that's fine. I think that's okay for us to have that kind of mutual understanding. But even that, I think I'm interested to watch China. What will happen? Like it's created so much tension, and I think we're hearing that big office buildings are limiting the number of people that can come back in. Many different corners, hearing about about a third of the workforce are back, and maybe up to 2/3 of the workforce are kind of back.
Yeah, Susie's company's been doing
a lot of people
like alternate days, like team A, team B, and they do alternate days, so only half the people are in the office at a given time.
Still a lot of people not back into the cities where they work and live from the Chinese New Year celebration. And that would be an interesting thing, because that to me, like I understand the tradition of it, but it does seem a bit antiquated in China to have essentially the whole country have a week off for the October 1st national holiday, and a week off
National Golden Week and
Chinese New Year.
Yeah, and so
you're going to put an entire population in motion at the exact same time every year at 2 times of the year. And I think when people weren't traveling all over the country and so widely dispersed, that was a lot more doable. And when taking, a 50-hour train ride was a significant enough barrier for you to do that it just sort of naturally regulated it.
Right.
But with such an efficient high-speed rail system in place, you put an entire country in motion at one time seems kind of risky, and that it would make more sense to say, well, we at some point this needs to be more rational, and people need to have more choice over it, because that's always another sort of trade-off of that, is because of those significant public holidays, then you may get 2 days of discretionary vacation or 5 days of discretionary vacation in the year's time, where you would choose. I think younger generations will push back on some of that. So this is an interesting catalyst for China, more so than any place in the world. Like, this is a catalyst to kind of address issues that are problematic or uncomfortable, or that they're no longer willing to accept, having gone through sort of a forced shutdown like this. I think in the U.S., it's hard to say what would be some really major significant changes, because it's the nature of governance and politics here, is that it's not meant to sort of change that drastically and that dramatically, and there's a limit to what the government can really tell us we're going to do. I think what and which has always been the case for the U.S., the big driver of change is what individuals who form together in corporations, and for various reasons, that what they kind of choose to do and where they choose to pursue opportunities. The response to the coronavirus in the U.S. ultimately will be that. It'll be, where did people see we were lacking and there's an opportunity to do something? And some of those will be nonprofit, and some of those will be valuable for-profit enterprises. I mean, if they're providing value, I think it's totally reasonable that people get some rewards for that. But there will be a variety of responses as well. And obviously, one of the things that will be looked at very closely, and people will see as an opportunity as well, is that we're getting to a level of kind of a new era of manufacturing technology and rising costs and political risks and others add on to that, currency risks and so forth, of having such a heavy reliance on manufacturing in China, and that it would make sense for some of that to come back to the United States. Not even just let's go look for other low-cost centers. That there will be enough things that we find are profitable to produce in the United States.
Mm-hmm. Well,
and especially in pharmaceutical, medical. Hopefully, we're all at the point that we're uncomfortable with the reason this supply chain is set up the way it is because we can really take advantage of people in very bad labor environments around the world.
Yeah. I think there's probably more room for unity on that idea across a political spectrum for that reason you just said. I think that's a good way to advocate for that where it works. So, upside, last question. It can be personal, it can be wider, bigger picture, but maybe it's best as a personal. What's an upside that you're looking forward to?
I'm anticipating that this has been kind of perspective shifting for a lot of people. Like, we appreciate proximity to each other more when we have that opportunity again. Mm-hmm. And it seems like we probably won't have that opportunity until, I'm not an expert on it, but certainly a vaccine would go a long ways towards that, or at least a significant amount of immunity within the population, and not seeing massive resurgence. And so I'm very interested to see that. I think we'll have our eye much more closely on the ball of these kinds of potential hotspots and places because they've known for quite a long time, as we know. And I'm not saying I know exactly the origin of this, but they know, like, in particular, like, we talk about bats quite frequently, but that they're a reservoir for other coronaviruses that have not yet, made a move through an intermediate host into human populations. And so that's probably just a matter of time as we have put more pressure on kind of natural habitats around the world. And it's fascinating, like how many, I mean, there's so many bat species. I think of all the mammals in the world, it's like over 50% or some really high number are bats. So we're going to have exposure to new things at new times. This won't be the only kind of one, but we've gone through this and now have a bit more of how these things are recognized. And maybe that even within our lifetime, there's not such a random mutation and jump and sort of alignment of circumstances that expose a population. Hopefully not. But I think, we all come out of this, like we've been sort of locked up. We've lost a lot and kind of suffered a lot. And in a way, like almost like a post World War II kind of sigh of relief, but without the massive destruction. So not equating those particularly, but a big sigh of relief, because there's anxiety everywhere. You can sense it. I mean, if you've taken big risks, and even I'll say on behalf of like my company and my partner, it's been a big risk to put the time and focus in, instead of working at a Goldman or a Wanda or someplace, but building something of our own. And I think we've felt very gratified that we've had some big clients and we've served them well. We've grown the business, and to have it from like Chinese New Year until now just stop, because we're uniquely positioned in these two markets, and we know that the impacted side of business on China is going to take a little bit of time to get back. But I still think it's like smart movers now will recognize this for like when people are panicked and people are down, there's great opportunities. Not say to take advantage of their pain, but to make a move when you might have more reasonable kind of multiples, more reasonable projections. And I would suspect that there's going to be a pretty healthy bounce back, with the exception that there's been a depletion from people's lives, from individual families, households, companies even. There's been kind of a steady depletion for several months now, and probably in the U.S. it's been a little less than that, but it'll go on longer, because we're just further down the timeline. And that will take some effort to kind of build that back up, where people feel like, I didn't have what I did have in savings, I depleted during that time. And now I'm going to be focused on sort of getting that shored back up, and even have a better plan to have a better footing underneath me. It's not all that helpful to entrepreneurs who are, and to other business owners who are living like really kind of in an early growth stage of their business, and they can deplete all their resources quite quickly and find, look, if they still have major capital investments and they've got debt service and they've got rent and they've got other things like that, they may not survive. And that doesn't mean that they disappear, they explode off the face of the earth or anything, but it means that there's kind of a regroup, and it's going to be painful for some people, and just for reasons outside of their control. I mean, we felt it to an extent, and we had just moved here prior, and so that puts extra, because moving from continent to continent is not always
it's not a cheap thing,
cheap proposal, and you've got expenses on both sides of that that sort of long permanent commute that hit you. And so that hit us as right before we got established here, and obviously got into this next phase. But that said, the fundamentals are still really strong, and things will come back around. There will be interesting opportunities.
Well,
I think all that said, I'm curious, like, have you been keeping yourself kind of occupied with? It is one of the great things that we're all very well connected, and you can find your kind of tribe and your much extended tribe in various forms online, and there's great content to catch up on. There's good everybody seems to be watching a lot of the same things. But I love to hear. It's a great time for lists right now, like your top 10 pandemic or shelter at home recipes.
Well, I mean, I guess short version of my experience is that what I've been seeing, and so for one thing, of course, priority number one is continued work developing this movie project that we're both on, and of course you're pretty up to date on all of that since you're a key part of it. But developing how do we deal with this contingency wise? So getting all that together, of course, and some longer term thinking schedule wise about how things, the different scenarios that we could be facing and how do you deal with each one. But in addition to that, I've been dealing with podcasts, and so I rebooted Big Fish in the Middle Kingdom, as you know, and I've got If I Knew You Better Here going strong, and Ying is my co-host on How China Works. Ying Li is back in Beijing, and she's been doing interviews herself when she can. And again, we're all pretty much living on Skype or Zoom these days, not in person. But I'm still editing those and doing the production end of that. So, those, I mean, each one of those is like a, quarter time unpaid job. So doing 3 shows in addition to my main work, and then rewriting this, I'm polishing this TV pilot that you're aware of. And hopefully within I'm aiming for basically a week from today is when I want to start sending it to a small selection of readers, including you. So between all of that,
that's the perfect time for it. People are reading, and
I figure it's good timing to get that out there. So I definitely, while I've got it out for comments, I'm going to work on the Bible, which is, people who aren't in this racket is essentially the guide to the whole thing from like a high level view. Who are the characters? What would you do season to season if you're fortunate to go that far, episode to episode for the first season? And I know all that stuff. I've already got it all mapped out, written in Evernote. I just have to turn that into a document that you would present to somebody along with a script. So not an inconsequential task, but while I've got the script out from notes, that's what I'm going to switch gears. So between all of this, and then just the day to day, how do I get food? How do I do this? As I'm subletting my friend's place here in Hollywood, and I was, walking where I could, but I'm at the base of Runyon Canyon. It's a very steep hill, so I can't really schlep all the way up the hill with a substantial amount of groceries from the Ralph's. That's like, half a kilometer away, basically. Yeah, and yes, I've been.
The Ralph's down on
Sunset.
Down on Sunset,
yeah. I'm up at the top of North Fuller. If anyone who knows Runyon Canyon, there are 2 different apartment buildings that are kind of either side, and I'm at the one on the right, the pinnacle. So, no,
I know it really well. That's awesome.
Yeah, and I got a great view of the people who were not social distancing until the Popo finally came and closed it on Wednesday.
They closed Runyon.
Finally.
No hikers.
Finally, yeah. And I'm sorry to people who
miss it. There's a lot of hikers around here, but there's a lot of hikers here, but people do stay their distance. It's just a little easier because there's not the population not nearly as dense here. You would
think that it was ridiculous at some times with how many people were all clustered together and running around. And anyway, so but yeah, so for me, I guess what I was getting at is that having been mostly self-employed for most of my life, I'm used to work and being more, I'm an introvert who kind of plays an extrovert when I have to, so I tip that way. I'm fairly in the middle, I guess. But the reality is that I'm happy to work alone. There's a time for teamwork and there's a time for solo work. And so much of what I do is solo work. So I'm used to this. I've mostly worked on my own or from home for years. So for me, this is I'm just set up in a new temporary place and I'm doing what I always do, There's different noise out the window, different sights. And I'm really fortunate to be here subletting my actor friend's place who's back home in New Zealand. He was down there for a stay for various reasons ahead of this, and then now this has extended his stay indefinitely, and so it's extended my stay indefinitely. But what is not indefinite are people's patience, and so I fear I am rattling on too much. Jonathan, do you have any closing thoughts before I
was just going to say, like, I've noticed
your mission of peace and goodwill?
I've noticed in the last, like, I don't know how many months it's been. You've been, doing kind of special diet and exercise and got yourself in much better condition.
Yeah.
Which is great. And I think it's also one of the things we kind of look forward to as bit of a bright spot, that especially seeing how underlying health conditions and weight is, not to like fat shame anybody, but those are real contributing factors to your vulnerability. And those are things that people can do something about. And there's a lot of positive support to do that. And there's a lot of great sort of testimonials all the time of people, committing and showing results. And I'm hopeful also that's something that will be a knock-on side effect. And again, like one of the reasons that moving back here to the U.S. was a priority, because as I look at the mountains out in the distance here, I enjoy skiing and rock climbing and cycling, and that's a really hard set of things to do in China. And those things will come around and eventually catch up, and you do see some great groups out in the Miyun and Huairou and the north side of Beijing.
You can do all of that stuff, just not all conveniently in the same location.
Yeah, that's someone like here where
it involves
I've put in a lot of work in the business, but then I'd love to just jump on my bike. I can ride out and be up like 2 or 3 canyons nearby in no time. And that said, other things that we're all really grateful for that we had taken for granted a bit is the zoo, the Natural History Museum nearby, and our public library, which we have a 19-month-old, Chloe, and she just loves like every activity at the library. And they're so great here with like a little book baby program twice a week, and a mom and baby yoga on
fun.
Like once a week, and there's 2 branches that are right close by. It was kind of funny, the last day before the library closed, they announced that, which was nice of them to give us some notice that they were closing down. And we went in, and there's not a huge Chinese population here in Salt Lake, but there were quite a few Chinese families that are here. They're working with the University of Utah. They're here on some other kind of work assignment, or the people right from the mainland who'd just been here a short period of time. And some of them we've become good friends with, but they're all there as well, taking advantage of sort of the last time to check out a stack of books. And so that's what I'm kind of working my way through as well. And that's been good. Make the best of, a difficult situation. And hopefully we will all be looking back on this with some relief in the next month or 2, somewhere in that time.
I love it. Well, thanks a lot, man. I'll be in touch with you, and look forward to seeing you on the other side of all this, whenever that is.
All right, we'll keep in touch, man. Thanks.